Words, and thank you very much, Ambassador, for firstly your support and presence, and secondly your kind words. I'm going to talk a little bit today about, I guess, theories of or paradigms of poverty reduction, inequality reduction. What are some of the global issues and global trends? I'm going to talk less about the numbers and the facts. There are people here much more competent to do that than I am. So I'll start off at the global level and then come to South Africa and look at what our strategies for the last 15, 17 years have been and what the state of play is. Let me start off with a little bit of a discourse from the UK. Following the riots in London a few weeks ago, there are two narratives about the causes of those riots. On the one hand, you have people arguing that relatively high levels of youth unemployment, about 20–25%, mistrust of the police, serious morale problems in the fact that young people feel that they can't get jobs, they can't get heard, budget cuts are reducing social cohesion and social institutions, and that's the main reason why you had the riots. On the other side of the story, David Cameron's view is that there's been a fundamental breakdown in morality at the family level. Parents can't discipline their children, and that's the key problem. And what we're seeing is the social consequences of a nanny state and disempowering parents and communities. Now, in one sense, they're both right, and in one sense, they're both wrong. But these two perspectives come from very different paradigms about the role of the state in society, about the role of the state in development, in poverty reduction, in reducing inequality. And these different paradigms are not unique to the UK, certainly not unique to South Africa. I guess globally we've lived through a period of the last few years where a number of these paradigms have become, have come under attack, have been questioned. On the one hand, the markets over alles paradigm has certainly come under attack. The financial crisis, the way in which markets conducted themselves, behaved, the way in which markets related to ordinary people, has certainly demonstrated that markets on their own are insufficient to reduce poverty and inequality, wherever that may be, whether that may be in a country as poor as Vietnam or Sudan, or as rich as the US or parts of the EU. And so while markets have a role to play, and labor markets and employment in particular have a role to play, markets on their own are insufficient and have proved insufficient to fight poverty and inequality. At the other extreme, you have a welfarist model whose view is that the state has to provide certain services, from education to health to social protection, social safety nets, and those are the key instruments to fight poverty. And I think that paradigm has also come under attack in the last few years, as budget deficits have spiraled and governments aren't able to sustain those programs. There's a general view that the welfarist model on its own is insufficiently capable of sustaining a reduction in poverty and inequality. There's then, I guess, a more middle-of-the-road model, what's called a knowledge economy model, that has also come under attack. I guess the Democrats or the liberals in the US and in parts of Europe and in parts of the developing world have been of the view that knowledge is an asset like a house or land, and it's the asset of the future, and if people have knowledge, then they'll be able to leverage that knowledge to generate income and wealth. And what we've seen, if you take the Arab Spring, where levels of education were relatively high. A lot of the people who are unemployed in a place like Tunisia or Algeria or Egypt were university graduates. They had fairly good technical skills, much better than most poor countries. But yet the labor markets didn't function, yet the economy wasn't creating enough jobs. And so you had a group of people who were more educated, had potentially higher levels of expectation, and that increased the level of frustration. And so the knowledge economy model on its own is also not proven to be a robust and resilient means of fighting poverty and inequality. And so at the extremes, all of these models, the markets on its own, the idea of improving educational standards on its own, or the welfarist model on its own, has not proven to be a significant or sufficiently robust means of fighting poverty. The second dimension of the poverty debate in the world has been the impact of globalization. And this has had two effects. The first effect is that globalization has certainly increased market size, it's increased the size of the global economy with which people can trade, and it has allowed countries like China, like India, to export its way out of poverty in one sense. The East Asian model has essentially been to sell goods at relatively low value add to richer countries, generate significant export revenues, to invest in education and infrastructure and employment. And so globalization has had the positive benefit of allowing literally hundreds of millions of people to be lifted out of poverty. Globalization, however, has also had another effect. It has contributed to the significant increase in inequality that we've seen globally. And this has happened through two mechanisms largely. Firstly, if you add 2 billion new people to the pool of unskilled labor costs fall. And so even a low-skilled worker in the US is being competed out of jobs and wages by low-skilled entrants into the labor market in a place like India and China. And you see falling wages of low-skilled sectors, and that's happened in South Africa, that's happened in Brazil, that's happened in the EU, that's happened in the US. The significant expansion of the low-skilled labor force has helped drain or lower the salaries of lower-skilled workers. At the same time, the earnings of higher-skilled workers have gone up, partly because of global skill shortages, and partly because capital is mobile. Capital chases the highest return, and so capital can invest anywhere, whether it's a small factory in Vietnam or in an IT shop in California, in the US. Capital is mobile, and so people with capital have seen extremely high rates of return to that capital as they continuously chase for the highest yields. And these phenomena, on the one hand, the depression of low and middle skilled wages as a result of partly of globalization and mechanization, combined with the fact that capital is mobile and people with capital they've got a larger pool with which to invest and to search for higher rates of return, has contributed to probably an unprecedented rise in inequality globally. There's almost no country, and there are one or two exceptions, I'll come back to that in a moment, but almost every country in the world has seen an increase in inequality in the last 2 or 3 decades. The countries that experience the fastest growth in inequality is China and India. China has gone from a Gini of almost nothing, about 0.2 or so, to a Gini of about 0.4, 0.45 in the space of 20 years. That's a phenomenal increase in the Gini. In South Africa, we started off in 1994 with a very high Gini coefficient, probably around 0.66 to 0.68. It's gone up to about somewhere between 0.68 and 0.7. A small increase in the inequality, but a relatively marginal one relative to what we've seen happen to the Gini coefficients in India and China. And these are the two countries that have made the fastest progress in reducing the number of people living in poverty. And so it raises the complexity of the debate and understanding of the linkages between poverty reduction and inequality are even more important today than at any point in our history. Brazil has made progress in reducing poverty and the level of inequality. And in some sense, they are an outlier in this. If you look at the debate and the data on inequality and poverty data globally, Brazil is certainly an outlier. And South African policymakers look at Brazil and we scratch our heads. Why did they get it right and we didn't? We did almost all the same things. They've had fairly conservative macroeconomic policies, lower budget deficits. We have that. We introduced inflation targeting at about the same time that they did. They've got fairly high real interest rates. So do we. They had a significant liberalization of their capital account. So did we. We introduced social grants. So did they. They spend about 1.2% of GDP on social grants. We spend 3.2% of GDP on social grants. They've got about a tenth of the population receiving social grants. We've got about a quarter, just over a quarter of the population receiving social grants. In almost every area, we've got tight labor laws, they've got tight labor laws, they've got minimum wages, we've got minimum wages. Almost all the features of the reforms in Brazil and South Africa at surface level appears the same. But they've been able to create jobs at a faster rate than we have, and they've been able to create low-skill jobs at a much faster rate than we have. Partly because they've got agriculture and agro-processing right, whereas the bulk of our increase in exports was in the mining sector, the bulk of their increase in exports was in agriculture and agro-processing, which is far more labor-intensive. But Brazil is an exception to that general global trend, and it's a very worrying global trend. If, like us, we have the view that inequality is a bad thing and that we strive for a world with lower levels of inequality, then the last 2 or 3 decades certainly depress us. And the signs are not obvious on how to fix that. And hopefully this conference will provide some of those solutions. In South Africa, turning to South Africa, we've certainly had a multidimensional approach to poverty reduction and inequality. And I'll deal with those distinctly. In 1994, emerging from the RDP document and the Ready to Govern document, we had what we called a basic needs approach. Our view was that if we provided people with basic needs in the form of housing, water, sanitation, electricity, A, that would improve their lives and livelihoods, and B, that would allow them to engage with the labor market, with the formal economy. It would not just improve their lives, but it will improve their chances of moving up the income scale. That's not been a very successful model. It has improved livelihoods. While you can't measure it in income and GDP, if somebody has got a tap 100 meters away from their house versus a tap in their house, it is an improvement in the quality of life. And the data and the GDP numbers don't capture this, but certainly this is positive. Somebody who did not have electricity and who now does have electricity, it is an improvement in their quality of life. We've not yet seen that translate into a significant improvement in a money metric poverty measure, and that needs to be looked at. As I pointed out before, the second major effort in South Africa has been social grants. And my view of that is that it's been a hugely positive development in South Africa. We have been able to reduce extreme poverty. If you take a very low poverty line, around about 120 Rand a month per person, more or less $1, or even if you take a $2 line, at those levels, we have been able to make significant progress in reducing the levels of poverty. If you take a higher poverty line, around 400 or 500 Rand a month, we've made very modest progress in improving poverty, in reducing poverty, given that. And so social grants, by our estimate, has contributed about 2/3 to the fall in poverty since 1994. In Brazil, it's contributed 50% to the fall in poverty, with the other 50% coming from low-wage employment. And so what we've seen on the composition of income, and Marie Leibrandt and Ingrid Woolard would show this later, there's been a significant change to the composition of income of the poorest 40%. Whereas in 1994, they got a significant share of income from remittances, from urban migrants. That's fallen to very low levels. And while in 1994 wage income accounted for about a third of their income, that too has fallen, partly because there's fewer employment opportunities for low-skilled workers, partly because the two largest sectors that employed low-skilled people, agriculture and mining, have shed jobs significantly in the last 20 years. So the social grants have prevented the problem from becoming even worse. In 1995, the poorest 40% accounted for about 6% of national income. Today they account for about 6% of national income, but there's been significant compositional changes, and if it wasn't for the grants, the picture would have been much worse. Public employment programs have been a feature of South Africa's poverty reduction strategy since as early as 1996-97. While we've had some very successful programs, particularly in the environmental area, programs like Working for Water, Working on Fire, some of the land care programs, more recently the community-based public works programs, again partially donor funded, and the pilots around that have been successful, we've not been able to scale it up to a significant level to the point where it can make a meaningful difference to poverty reduction. Given the resources that we've thrown at public works programs, there's no reason why we can't employ probably a quarter, maybe even a third of unemployed people in some form of public employment program, even if they're not permanent programs. However, we're only getting to about 5% of unemployed people now. And so we've simply not had the institutional and management capability to ramp those up and to scale them up. And so while public employment programs are an important element, they're really hard work. and we've not found ways of doing that. The fourth strategy that we've adopted in South Africa is what's broadly called the social wage, and I guess it combines elements of the strategies that I've mentioned earlier. The free basic electricity, free basic water, the no-fee schools policy, free health care for children under 6 and pregnant women, now pretty universal free health care. Those elements combined with housing and social grants comprise a social wage. And by our estimates, the social wage is a transfer of around about 3,000 or 4,000 rand per person in a poor household per year, which is not insignificant at 200-300 rand a month. Of course, the largest elements of that social wage is the no-fee schooling, but the free basic electricity is probably worth around 25 to 30 rand per month per household. The free basic water around a similar scale. So they're relatively low, but they're not insignificant strategies to fight poverty. And in my view, they have made a difference and an impact, a positive impact, but it's hard to measure that, especially when you use either money metric methods or variants or proxies for money metric poverty. And so I think that today, while we have made some progress in reducing the level of poverty, as I pointed out earlier, our level of inequality is either the same as it was in '94 or marginally higher. The data suggests it's probably marginally higher than it was in 1994, despite significant transfers and significant attempts, major strategies of government. And I think that one of the things that you'll grapple with over the next 2 days is what would the counterfactual have been? Would it have been worse? Or did we make policy mistakes? And are we making policy mistakes in the way in which we are tackling poverty and inequality? I guess to conclude where Ambassador de Geer left off, the Planning Commission published its diagnostic report on the 9th of June this year, and we outlined what we think were the 9 key reasons why we've not made sufficient impact on poverty and inequality. I won't go through all of those now. But we certainly highlighted the fact that low levels of employment and poor quality school education in African communities were key elements, but there were other issues, institutional issues, public service performance issues, economic structural issues that we outlined. And I think it attempts to provide a fairly holistic sense of what the challenges are going forward. To conclude, I'd like to thank Mistura and PSPPD and Alan in particular for organizing this workshop and this conference. Alan and Mistura, and as you pointed out, Vusi and a few other people in the presidency have really babysitted this program since the early 2000s. Painstakingly built it, and today it's a fairly successful attempt by government to try and understand poverty, understand inequality, understand not just the numbers, as Alan says, but what are the lives of poor people and how do they live? What are their joys and what are their sadnesses? What are the things that keep them awake at night and what are the things that make them happy and sad? And you have to look at the kinds of research and surveys that people around this, in this room, are involved in to get that fine-grained view of life of poverty in South Africa. Thank you.